Thanks very much for joining us today. Let me kick off this PhD student panel. So my name is Adrianna Kapek-Goodridge, and I am John's PhD researcher at Huddersfield University, and it will be about something fishy in the civilizing process. You love the title, I know. So before I carry on, I will time myself because, like Stephen, I get carried away, as some of you might know. So just a little plan, a little bit about what I like to call the animal civilizing process. Some of you might be familiar with it. Like I said, I've been going on about this for quite some time now. Then a little bit more about farm animal welfare governance. I will explain why I'm focusing on fish welfare. And then I will talk a little bit more about issues with Christmas carp in Poland, and then a little bit more about animal welfare NGOs and their activity, interdependencies, and kind of figurations in Poland. And hopefully you will have time for some questions. So John, let me know, please. I can see you on my screen, just you. So signal me when I'm getting close. Why is my slide? Oh, there we go. So the animal civilizing process, could this be a new direction for figurational sociology? Now, just to explain, do not grill me about this, animal is an inverted commas. It does not refer to relationships between animals, but it refers to human-animal relations and how these relations or how these attitudes, how these perceptions of animals are changing through shifts in human attitudes and their figurations. So it is about kind of animals, but it is about our approach to animals, their suffering and animal sentience, and then how that in turn changes people's perceptions and their figurations. So when I say animals, I mean non-human animals. I will not say non-human animals every single time because it's just a mouthful. So it's always animals when I refer to non-human animals. Now we can see that there is this kind of general civilizing process throughout the century. So there is a gradual change in approaches, but of course some animals are treated differently than others. And what that means is that when some animals like hogs, horses, dogs were used as working animals, they were of course treated differently because they had more value. And then with kind of this growth in people's sensibilities, when companion animals started to come around and people had more kind of sensitivity to them, then they became a little bit more important as well, and they were treated a little bit better than other animals. Now, we can see that there is this kind of general process that people's attitudes to animal suffering is kind of increasing. We can see that there are more sensibilities, and it's all predicated on recognizing animal sentience. So sentience is this ability to feel or to have feelings that matter. So there is a whole discussion on what sentience is, what it constitutes, but let's just kind of leave it at that, that it's just to have feelings that matter, to you or to that animal. So it's all predicated on sentience, that we recognize that animals can think, they can feel, and the more we find about them, the more compassionate we become, the more sensibilities we develop, and therefore there are more animal welfare movements, there is more vegetarianism, veganism, and of course there is more animal welfare activism. But at the same time, we can see that there are more and more animals slaughtered for human consumption each year. So, with this process, we can see that as it is with the civilizing process, that certain things become maybe offensive to, civilized sensibilities. It is the same with, for example, slaughtering animals or even carving meat at the table, and then kind of slowly moving the local butchers to rural areas, faraway places, away from, the civilized eyes, and we distance ourselves from that act of killing an animal. And that's an important point because we will go back to it when I'm talking about a carp in Poland. Now, the same ambivalence can be seen in recognition of animal sentience. So we can see that there is increased research into sentience, but also there is increased animal testing, despite kind of growing efforts of NGOs and other organizations to kind of stop this practice. And it is similarly with industrial farming. So there is this whole massive European figuration, and it's a process that goes forward, but can also regress. So as with the civilizing process between humans, when it comes to kind of human suffering, it's the same with animal suffering. So we have civilizing spurts, but also decivilizing spurts, which industrial farming is, I think, a good example of. Now, is that... Oh, there we go. So we have a smaller figuration of animal welfare governance within this kind of whole animal civilizing process. And the smaller figuration consists of governments, NGOs, retailers, and consumers. So of course, even though there is this general process where people's attitudes to animal suffering are changing, there are still different levels of attitudes to farm animal welfare and animal suffering. So because of that, I have chosen Poland and the UK as case studies. So in UK has a very long, one of the longest histories of animal activism in Europe, whereas Poland is one of the shortest ones, and it's within that group of states that have history of state socialism, and these states kind of share similar views or have similar approaches to farm animal welfare and animal suffering. Now we can see that within this figuration, people, as they become more sensitive to animal suffering, they form NGOs and they try to change things, and they are these outsider NGOs that are challenging the balance of power that is set by the established government. So it's kind of the NGOs that are trying to take more part in maybe legislative changes or even creating their own private standards. So in the UK, there are various factors that influence how NGOs operate. So there is a whole unique discourse for kind of each country. So in the UK, it's food scarce, agro-food movements, and so on. But to be more effective, NGOs legitimize their agenda for establishing relations with retailers. So because of that, this is a kind of a small figuration of the ethical complex. So I'm fusing these two concepts together. And the ethical complex is a unique discourse for the UK because it describes these power relations between NGOs, media, retailers, and consumers. And it shows how NGOs can have a similar amount of power as media and retailers in the UK. How has that come about because of food scarce and agro-food movements, and how it has led for NGOs to have this dialogue and this conversation and these partnerships with supermarkets. So it's a very unique discourse that shows how NGOs require or ask for ethical sourcing from retailers, for example, and how in turn they influence consumers. Now, there hasn't been an investigation done in Poland when it comes to this figuration and when it comes to kind of these relationships between governments, NGOs, and retailers, and that's but that's my aim, and that's what I am doing. So a little bit more about farm animal welfare governance and how I'm focusing on Poland with that. Well, governance just generally is a shift from the delivery-only government to more autonomous societies. So if you're in a boat, it's from kind of a rowing society to a steering society. And that happens because societies are not satisfied with the outcome of action at local, national, it can be any levels, European levels. So at the European level, we can see some NGOs that are working within the EU to try and change, let's say, farm animal welfare legislation or to improve it. And it's the same nationally. And because of different kind of attitudes to farm animal welfare, we can see different types of governance. So it's a movement from kind of governmental to private measures. So government does not take as much part in maybe creating farm animal welfare legislation or changing it, but it's the NGOs how are taking part, and these NGOs are created by, of course, people who express this dissatisfaction with farm animal welfare issues. So we have Race to the Top in the UK, Business Benchmark on Farm Animal Welfare, and we have Welfare Quality Project, which is not only in the UK, but it's a European project, and Poland was not included in that. So I am looking at, from a similar point of view as welfare quality and farm animal welfare standards in Poland. So of course, there are differences in governance among EU member states. Also, they are predicated on how people perceive farm animal welfare, and there are all these different traditional, cultural, and economic impacts that take part in kind of these differences in governance, and it all happens despite the fact that EU directives recognize animals as sentient beings rather than agricultural products. So we can see that this interpretation of EU directives is so much different among EU member states. So now why I'm focusing on fish welfare, let me just check the time. So I'm focusing on fish welfare because fish are omitted in most regulations on farm animal welfare. There is, of course, lack of species-specific legislation. So in the EU, there is only a handful of species like broilers or pregnant sows that they have species-specific legislation, but there is none for fish. They are kind of one of the most omitted kind of animals in legislation generally, but also in kind of NGO campaigns. So if it's not an NGO that is directly involved in improving fish welfare, then there is a small chance that they have some form of campaign or dialogue when it comes to fish welfare. Now, there is only general advice regarding slaughter and transport, so it basically means to spare unnecessary suffering. And whatever that means, this is up for interpretation. And even with recent research into fish welfare and fish sentience and how fish experience pain, the fish are still killed by asphyxiation, evisceration, gibbing, and rapid chilling. So all these things are happening, which provide a vast field for discussion on fish welfare, sentience, and how fish, experience and how they feel pain and how they should be handled, how they should be slaughtered, transported, and so on. So that's my focus. Now, a little bit more about Christmas carp in Poland. And as some of you may know, there is a big tradition in Poland to eat carp for Christmas. And Christmas 24th, which is Christmas Eve, is the most important day for Poles, and it's supposed to be meatless. And because it's in like this Polish Christian tradition to eat fish when something is supposed to be meatless, because apparently, despite what other voices of research, fish is not meat, then we eat fish. Now, you can see that this is already a difference between other European countries or even the UK. In the UK, NGOs talk about sea bass, panga, haddock, salmon. You might have heard about Scottish salmon, cod, and so on. So there is a discussion on a whole range of fish welfare issues, farming and slaughtering and selling and labeling and so on. But in Poland, this discussion only is surrounding one type of fish, which is carp, and it's only once a year, which is during Christmas. And this kind of tradition is not as old as one might think. It was a way for the communist government to tackle post-World War II hunger. So carp is a fish that grows quite quickly. It's not very tasty, but there is just this tradition that, it was cheap. It is cheap to kind of raise it, and then you sell it in places like this. So when supermarkets emerged in late 90s, early 2000s in Poland, ponds like this or little marketplaces like this, you could see in supermarkets. Now, interestingly, because of the work of NGOs, and supposedly consumer demand, supermarkets have stopped selling them because of the whole range of fish welfare issues that is associated with pain. And another interesting thing is that the arguments presented by NGOs are not as successful when it comes to fish welfare when they are talking about human welfare. So human welfare arguments are always more useful, or they have kind of more sway when you are trying to improve farm animal welfare as general, but in this case, fish welfare. So in ponds like this, now we have two French supermarkets, so Intermarché and Carrefour, I think, that are still selling live carp during Christmas, but the rest have stopped doing it. And we have places like this, what you can see in the pictures. So behind you see there is a shopping mall, there are markets, supermarkets, and so on. And places like this are not unusual. They have always been around, whether supermarkets have emerged or not. So you come to a place like this, you buy a live fish. In the background, you can see there is a man with a white bag. You put a fish with a bit of water in the bag, or without water, depends how far away you live. You take that fish home, put it in your bathtub, maybe feed it a bit of bread or something, and then you kill it yourself. So we can see that, throughout, for such a long time, people have been distancing themselves from that act of killing an animal, this not to offend these civilized sensibilities. And here in Poland, every year we have this when people just buy it and kill it themselves at home. And there is a whole range, of course, of fish welfare issues because overcrowding, disease, and so on. On the left, you can see how it's being done. There is not only carp in there, but carp is, mostly prominent. And there isn't really a farm animal welfare legislation in Poland that would stop people from doing it. It's the towns that are actually, or cities that are renting this place for these producers to actually stand there and do it. What is interesting that the government is allowing kind of the main veterinary office to release veterinary instructions, and these veterinarians have been pushed by NGOs to improve fish welfare. So what they've done, they said that fish can breathe through their skin, and all you need to do is just put like an additional plastic net inside your plastic bag, so create more plastic. And if you put your fish in there, then 3 millimeters of that plastic is going to allow fish to breathe better, and then welfare will be magically improved. So just things like that. And we can see that this reluctancy to improve animal welfare or veterinary instructions reflects how people think about farm animal welfare or fish welfare in Poland especially, and how these components of tradition and culture come into it as well. So on the right hand side in the picture you can see what's happening after. There is a bit of ice because it was a very cold winter, and these pictures have been taken by me during my observations for my data analysis last year in Poland. So if a fish is swimming belly up, we all know what that means. And this is another place. So it's a pond where you can go directly. In the background, you can see there is a car. It says fish sales. People go and then just buy a fish in the same manner. So basically, that's what all was happening. Now, in this kind of small figurations of how NGOs go about it, their behavior, their practice, and their kind of relationships with all these other stakeholders that are involved in fish welfare and improving that. So we can see that from what I have gathered so far in my data is that NGOs are focused mostly on reducing suffering rather than welfare improvements. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, this rhetoric is very important to them. And it's important because there are different understandings of animal welfare. So even though you can see there is a roster of what animal welfare means, you can see welfare quality examples of what animal welfare constitutes. You can when I'm talking to NGOs, are they reducing suffering, or it does not equal the same as welfare improvement. So that was quite surprising for me when I didn't actually take that into consideration at the beginning, but that was a big thing for them. So of course NGOs work in different ways to try and improve fish welfare. So sometimes they do campaigning, they do field work, or they try partnerships. So partnerships is kind of this UK domain, British domain, whereas in Poland they do try partnerships, but it tends that supermarkets will tell them one thing and then they'll say, yes, we will not, or no, we will not sell carp this year, and then in the next week they've actually set up the ponds in their supermarkets. So just generally, lying.
Adrianna, you need to be thinking about wrapping up soon, yeah?
That's the last slide. That's the last slide. So the dialogue with marketplaces and town/city councils, I've put it there because I am to follow up on this year, what happened last year with the dialogue, because that was the first year that they were going to talk to town and city councils about renting that space for these ponds, because they were successful previously with space for circuses and so on. So hopefully I'll see what they came up with and what the conversation looked like. And of course their main focus is to reduce suffering, so fish suffering, raising people's awareness, despite the fact that consumers tend to think, like 80% of Polish consumers tend to think that we shouldn't be selling live carp or buying live carp, just buy a frozen one. Yet every year when I spoke with the producers, these sales are increasing. So, and we know that consumer attitudes do not reflect shopping habits. So people might say that they care about animals or animal welfare, yet they will go and buy live carp, or even in the UK, they will go and buy that chicken from Morrison's, despite the campaigns for, let's say, Franken chickens. So, like I mentioned before, that attitudes to fish welfare are reflected in government's reluctance to change legislation and these veterinary instructions that I've talked about before when I was talking about the nets and so on. So there is still a lot to explore, and there is still a lot of data for me to analyze. So I am still kind of in the middle of it, but these are the kind of figurations and these relationships. There is a lot to unpack when it comes to this governance figuration in Poland when it comes to fish welfare. But I think Elias, lends well to those. So thank you very much